The Kethbaran offered him everything he had ever wanted. He said, no. The refusal took about 4 seconds. It took the Kethbaran the better part of 6 months to understand it. Dario Reyes had been a sculptor before the war. Not the famous kind. Not the kind with gallery openings and retrospectives and patrons in expensive shoes who said things like evocative and challenging and meant them as compliments. But the kind who worked out of a converted boiler room in Wuj, who spent 12-hour days with his hands inside clay and wire armature, and sometimes wept at the way light fell through a particular window at 4 in the afternoon. He made things that were strange and uncomfortable to look at. Figures half emerging from stone like they hadn't decided yet whether the world was worth entering. Hands that were too large, reaching toward nothing specific. Bodies caught mid-stumble in the act of catching themselves. He had sold maybe 20 pieces in his lifetime, which had been fine. He had not become a sculptor to sell things. He had become a sculptor because one afternoon when he was 17 years old, he had picked up a lump of clay that smelled of the Galician riverbank and understood, with a physical certainty that bypassed every coherent thought he'd ever had, that his hands needed to be inside things, needed to be changing them, needed to understand from the inside what a form was trying to become. He did not especially care whether anyone else understood that. The work understood it. That had always been enough. Then the Hethvaran arrived. There's a version of that story everyone knows now. The long shadow across the stratosphere, 400 kilometers wide. The silence that settled over every radio frequency and satellite signal and cellular network for 11 hours simultaneously. The way birds stopped calling, and dogs refused to leave basements, and every person on Earth who happened to be looking at the sky at that particular morning, regardless of hemisphere, looked at exactly the same place without knowing why. The broadcasts that followed in 214 languages simultaneously, the voice calm and precise and utterly inhuman, each language spoken perfectly, with the exact intonation and phonological texture of a native speaker, which was somehow worse than if it had been accented. The Kethvaran did not declare war. They declared reclamation. They had been watching humanity for a very long time. They had decided, with the same dispassion an archaeologist might apply to a dig site, efficient, thorough, without malice, that the species had run its useful course. They would be collecting the viable genetic material. They would be preserving certain cultural artifacts in archival format. The physical infrastructure of human civilization would be repurposed for other projects. The remaining biological matter would be composted, which was a word they used with no apparent awareness of how it landed, or perhaps with perfect awareness, and simply no category in which to register that it might matter. Dario had heard the broadcast from the boiler room. He had been in the middle of shaping a hand. 5 fingers, reaching upward at a slightly desperate angle that he hadn't quite committed to yet. Hadn't decided whether desperation was what the piece was about, or whether it was something more ambiguous than that. He had set down his tools and listened until the broadcast ended, all 14 minutes of it. Then he had looked at the hand for a long time. Then he had picked up his tools and gone back to work. He finished it first. That seemed important, though he could not have explained why. It seemed like the kind of thing you did when you understood that the world was about to become a place where finishing things required fighting for. You finished the thing in front of you. You did it with your whole attention. You acknowledged that it was real. He spent 4 more hours on the hand. He got the weight right. That was the whole thing with hands, the weight of them. The way the bones and tendons told you something about intention that the face could hide. When he was satisfied, he wrapped it in a cloth, put it in his bag, and went to find out what was happening. What was happening was the end of the world, which was also the beginning of a different kind of world, which is how those things tend to work. The war lasted 4 years. Dario spent 3 of them underground, not a metaphor. The resistance, which was several resistances in the early months before necessity forced coordination, which had its own politics and grievances and tactical disagreements and occasionally fatal miscommunications, which was human in every way that meant it was complicated and stubborn and occasionally brilliant and occasionally catastrophically wrong, had converted a decommissioned coal mine beneath the Carpathian Basin into a command and supply network that ran 300 kilometers on the main trunk and branched in 17 directions, with secondary networks connecting to former limestone quarries in the east, and a series of natural cave systems that a geology team had spent 3 weeks mapping in complete darkness using equipment that had not been designed for military applications. 31,000 people lived in the mine at peak capacity. It smelled like diesel and wet stone, and inexplicably, sometimes fresh bread, because someone had rigged a bakery near Junction 9 with salvaged industrial equipment and a supply line of flour that came in on the same trucks as weapons and medical supplies. And the bakery worked constantly, 2 shifts, because the commander had understood in the second month that 31,000 people would stop functioning if they stopped eating bread. That bread was not a luxury. That bread was the thing that told your body it was still in a world where bread happened. The smell traveled through the ventilation in ways that the structural engineers hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully explain. It arrived in the farthest tunnels, 12 kilometers from the source, faint but unmistakable at odd hours. Dario had read once about Proust and the Madeleine, the involuntary memory, the way smell bypassed the rational mind and went straight to something older and rawer and more honest. He thought about that a lot in the tunnels. The bread doing its patient work, telling 31,000 people that they were still human, that their bodies still needed things, that the world still contained the category of nourishment. He was not a soldier. He had been honest about this when he arrived, carrying the wrapped hand and a bag of tools and no relevant military experience whatsoever. The intake process had been efficient. They were very good at the intake process by then, having processed thousands of arrivals, having developed a triage system for skills that was both ruthless and surprisingly humane. He had been assigned to morale and education, which, in practical terms, meant there were 600 children in the mine, children who had been born there or brought there as infants, and who were growing up in rock, who knew the smell of diesel and wet stone as the smell of home, who had never felt rain, or stood in a field or seen a horizon farther away than the tunnel's end. They needed to know things. They needed to understand a world that existed above them, and that might, if enough people worked hard enough and were stubborn enough and were lucky enough, exist for them to inhabit someday. Dario taught them to draw. He gathered them in a wide chamber near Junction 7 that had been used for equipment storage before the storage needs outgrew it, and he talked to them about light. Not as a lesson in physics, though he knew enough of the physics to be accurate, but as a way of seeing. He told them that a shadow tells you the shape of the thing that cast it. He told them that you learn more from what's missing than from what's there. He told them to draw not what they thought they saw, but what they actually saw, and when they didn't know the difference yet. When they drew a hand with 6 fingers because their attention had drifted. When they drew a face with the features too close together because they'd never practiced looking. He told them that was fine. That was how it started. You drew wrong first and right later, and the wrong drawings were not failures. They were the first conversation with the subject. He kept their drawings on the walls of his bunk section with strips of old electrical tape. They covered 3 full panels, floor to ceiling, 200, 300 pieces over 18 months. Everything from wobbly attempts at dogs that had been described to them by parents who remembered dogs to increasingly confident renderings of tunnel life. The equipment, the other children, the faces of people they loved. One boy named Tomas drew the same face over and over for 4 months, a woman's face, with variations, and Dario had understood without asking that this was his mother's face, and that the boy was practicing, getting it right, which was also a way of keeping something. A girl named Prita, 8 years old, who had never seen the sky, drew the sun. She had received its description from her father, who was precise and careful with language and who had described it in terms of color and heat and the way it moved across the sky. And she had rendered this description in orange crayon with spikes radiating in all directions. Enormous, taking up half the page, a wild and confident and technically incorrect thing that was somehow, in the way that the most honest drawings always were, truer than accuracy. He looked at Prita's son whenever someone died, which happened regularly because the Keth Varen were not stupid, and they had eventually found the ventilation shafts. The Battle of the Eastern Corridor happened on a Tuesday. Dario spent the 18 hours of it in the medical sector, which shared space with the backup power generation station, in a practical arrangement that had seemed callous at first and had eventually come to feel inevitable. The generators keeping the lights on for the surgeries, and the surgeries keeping the people alive, who kept the generators running. Lieutenant Okonkwo had taken 17 people to hold the East Corridor with mining equipment that had been modified in ways that would have alarmed the manufacturers, and possibly alarmed the engineers who'd done the modifications if they'd had time to think about it too hard. Dario ran cables, he kept the generators fed, he did not fire a weapon. He had been offered weapons training in the second month, and had accepted it, and could operate 3 different kinds of small arms with adequate accuracy. But adequate accuracy was not what the East Corridor needed, and what it needed was for the power to stay on. So he kept the power on and listened to the sounds that traveled through rock in ways that were also not fully explicable. When the East Corridor went quiet, a specific quality of quiet that was different from the operational quiet of a functioning tunnel, an absence quality, a held breath quality. He knew before the runners came back. Okonkwo came in with 8 of her 17. She sat down next to generator 3, which was the loudest one, and put her face in her hands. Dario sat on the floor next to her. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that was not a kind of lie, that it had been necessary, that they had done everything right, that this was the cost of survival. All true things that would have been obscene to say out loud to a woman sitting next to a loud machine with 8 of her people instead of 17. He stayed until she lifted her face. He handed her a cup of water from his kit. She drank it without looking at him. She said, "The East is clear." He said, "Okay," she said. "For now." He said, "Okay." That was the whole conversation. It was enough. 3 days later, an envoy arrived. The signal had been agreed upon months earlier, in a set of protocols developed by the Coordination Committee in consultation with a small group of xenolinguists and evolutionary biologists and one philosopher of mind, who had been in the mine since the 3rd week and who had spent most of that time writing very long documents that nobody had time to read. The signal was a frequency pattern that the Kethvaran had been told would indicate a request for parley. Whether the Kethvaran had agreed to honor, it was not something anyone had been able to confirm, since confirming it would have required the kind of direct communication that only happened when someone was willing to be above ground within range of their surveillance. 3 people had been willing to do that in the previous year. 2 had come back. The envoy arrived at the mine entrance under the signal flag at 9 in the morning, which underground meant nothing, but was kept in the records because records needed times and the committees needed something to put in the boxes. The Kethvaran envoy was called a speaker, which was what the translation matrix called it, though the xenolinguist who designed the matrix had spent considerable time explaining that the translation was doing significant work, that the Kethvaran term was something closer to mouth of the collective, that speaker implied individual agency that the entity did not fully possess, that the translation was a useful lie. The speaker looked, from a distance, like smoke that had decided to organize itself into something with intentions. It had mass. You could tell from the way it moved through air, slightly heavier than it appeared, displacing things. But the mass was distributed in ways that the eye resisted tracking, surfaces that shifted between states that didn't have good names in any language Dario knew. It was neither solid nor liquid nor gas. It was the Kethvaran, which meant it was something else entirely. Up close, the sensory apparatus was the hardest part. It was arranged in a ring around the upper structure, which was not exactly a head, and it moved continuously. These slow, deliberate adjustments, opening and closing, widening and narrowing, that looked vaguely floral and felt like being comprehensively measured. The speaker was perceiving the room in frequencies and dimensions that had no human analog. It was doing this continuously, automatically, the way a person breathed. It had no particular awareness of how it felt to be on the receiving end of it. It had not developed that awareness yet. It spoke through a translation matrix that the Kethvaran had provided and the xenolinguist had refused to trust entirely. The voice arrived about half a second after the speaker's expression structure moved, which created the persistent and disorienting impression that the words were coming from a slightly different location than the entity itself. From just behind you, from a room adjacent to the one you were standing in. Dario would spend months adjusting to this and would eventually stop noticing it, which he later thought might be one of the more significant things that happened to him up there. The speaker said, "We have been observing your subsurface communities. We find them unexpectedly persistent." Commander Vasquez, who had been in command for 11 months, and who had the specific kind of composure that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having decided that fear was not going to get more than a fixed percentage of her available attention, said, "We find ourselves unexpectedly alive. We've had some assistance from stubbornness." The speaker was quiet for a moment. Its sensory apparatus did a slow adjustment, widening, opening, the whole ring shifting to a more receptive configuration. Dario, standing in the back of the small delegation, watched this and thought of Preeta's son and did not know why. The proposal the speaker delivered had been clearly prepared in advance, with the thoroughness that the Kethvaran brought to every logistical exercise. The Kethvaran would halt military operations in the Carpathian Basin and extend this ceasefire to 12 other resistance strongholds across 4 continents. The conditions: ongoing negotiation, commitment to open communication, and the provision of a specific human representative. Not a diplomat, not a military advisor. The translation matrix rendered the Kethvaran category as interpreter of forms, and the xenolinguist, who was present and watching with very large eyes, later said this was another translation doing a lot of work. That what the Kethvaran actually wanted was something closer to a maker of things that have not been made before, an artist. They wanted to understand why humans made things. Everyone stood in silence for a moment with the weight of this request. Then Vasquez said, "We'll need to discuss internally." The speaker said, "Expected we will return in 48 hours. It left the way it had arrived, unhurried, displacing air. In the corridor afterward, the xenolinguist said, "They want to understand us." That's not what the calculation was supposed to produce. Vasquez said, "Then maybe the calculation is wrong." The xenolinguist said, "Or they think they can find the flaw and fix it." Nobody answered that. Dario did not volunteer. He was nominated by consensus, which in practice meant that Vasquez found him in Junction 7 with 12 children and a discussion about how eyes worked, and looked at him for a moment with an expression that he had learned to read as apology, plus certainty, plus the specific respect of someone handing you something that was going to be very heavy and trusting you not to drop it. He said he'd think about it. He thought about it for 2 hours. He went and stood in front of the children's drawings, all of them, the whole 3 panels, and looked at each one. The dogs and the faces and the careful repetitions. Tomas's mother, version after version. Preeta's impossible son. He went back and said yes. Vasquez said, "I don't know what you're going up there to do," he said. "Neither do I. That's probably the right condition." She almost smiled. She said, "Try not to get killed," he said. "That's the plan." The Kethvaran vessel was vast in a way that was difficult to hold in the mind as a single thing. The section where Dario was kept, he had been instructed not to think of it as imprisonment, and had decided that instruction was probably accurate. It was something more like custody, like being held carefully, was modest relative to the rest of the ship. A room that was roughly the right temperature. Gravity adjusted to something close enough to Earth standard that walking required only minor recalibration. A surface that was not exactly a chair, but that functioned as one if you approached it without the assumption that it needed to be a chair before it could be sat on. They had provided food based on spectral analysis of human nutritional requirements, which arrived in portions that were adequate and tasted precisely like nothing. Texture and temperature correct, flavor absent. He ate it without complaint. Complaint seemed like a waste of the available energy. They had also provided materials. Not the materials he would have chosen. No clay, no stone, no wire, but a substance that responded to pressure and retained the shapes it was given, and had a density that was different from anything he'd worked with before, requiring recalibration of the pressure his hands expected to apply. And pigments. A range of pigments that mixed in ways that were initially baffling. Colors he didn't have names for that appeared between the colors he knew, gradients that moved in directions he had not anticipated. And that eventually, over the first 2 weeks, became interesting in a way that he'd only experienced with a new material once before. That first afternoon with the Galician clay. When a material surprised him, when it had opinions, he worked. The speaker visited daily, sometimes more than once. It would arrive, through a threshold that opened in the wall of the room, in a way that suggested it was designed to open, rather than that the speaker was passing through a fixed door, which was a distinction that felt like it mattered. And it would be present. That was the only accurate description. It was present in the room, in the way weather was present, filling the space it occupied without announcing itself, changing the quality of the air. It watched him work with the continuous adjustment of its sensory apparatus, the slow floral opening and closing. He had the strong sense in the first week that it was perceiving things about the materials, about the pressure he applied, about the shapes as they emerged, that he himself could not perceive. That it was receiving information from his working that was invisible to him, data points he wasn't generating for his own use. He found, after the second week, that he had stopped caring about this. It was like working next to a window that showed weather you didn't have words for, After a while, the window was just the window. He asked it questions, at first because he thought he should gather intelligence, and then because he was genuinely curious, and then because they had arrived at something that was neither intelligence gathering nor performance, but just the conversation that happened between two things, sharing a room for a long time. He said, "Your people, do you make things?" It said, "We record, we preserve, we replicate with high accuracy. We have produced archives of considerable scope, covering 47 planetary systems over what would translate to approximately 11,000 years of your time. This is not, we understand what you mean by making things." He said, "No, that's not what I mean." It said, "Explain the distinction." He said, "When you replicate something with high accuracy, the copy knows what it's supposed to be. The copy has the model. It's trying to match something. When you make something, actually make it. Start from nothing. You don't have a model. You don't know yet what it's supposed to be. That's what making is. The not knowing. The making and the not knowing are the same thing. You can't have one without the other." The speaker was quiet for longer than it usually was when processing language. He had developed a feel for the different silences. Processing silence, which was about 5 seconds. Something categorized silence, which was shorter. And what he'd started calling genuine pause silence, which was longer and felt different, felt like wait. This was genuine pause silence, it said. This seems like a critical inefficiency. He looked at what he was making, which was, so far, a shape he had no name for yet. Something between a closed fist and an opening hand, a moment of transition caught somewhere between two states. And this time he did smile. He said, "Yeah, the months accumulated." He made 37 pieces and named none of them, which the Kethvaran found significantly disturbing. They had recorded everything with their customary precision. Dimensions, material composition, color values, the chronological sequence of the work's development, everything, and the absence of a designation created what the speaker described, with the faintest possible note of distress, as an indexing problem. The pieces needed to be referenced. References required names. He had not provided names. The records therefore contained placeholders. Form 001 through Form 037, with subsections for the color variants and the material experiments. He told the speaker that those designations were fine as far as they went. He told it that he also didn't use them. The speaker said, "What designation do you use?" He said, "I don't." It said, "How do you reference the pieces when you think about them?" He thought about this honestly. He said, "I don't reference them. I remember them. It's different." This particular silence lasted longer than usual. He taught the speaker to mix the pigments. He did this not because it asked. It hadn't developed the categories to know to ask. But because one afternoon, which is to say one period of the ship's low-light cycle, he simply handed it a mixing tool and said, "Try." He had been watching it, watched pigments for 6 weeks, and had noticed something in the sensory apparatus adjustment when he mixed unexpected combinations. A particular kind of attention that he could only describe as heightened, and he had decided that heightened attention in an alien entity might be the closest available analog to interest. It held the mixing tool with the careful awkwardness of someone who had precise motor control applied to an unfamiliar task, not clumsy, exactly, but with an overcorrection quality, the way you moved in a new body in a dream. It pressed the pigments together with too much force and produced a smear that expanded across the medium surface. It adjusted. The smear became a field of color that had depth in it, that moved the eye in 3 directions simultaneously. It was, by any reasonable standard, beautiful. It had been made by accident, by someone who hadn't known what they were doing. He said, "What do you call that?" It said, "It does not have a designation." He said, "Give it one." The pause this time was genuine and long, and had a quality he hadn't encountered before, something almost pressurized. It said, "Insufficient data for designation assignment." He said, "That's not how it works." It said, "Explain." He said, "You're not assigning a designation. A designation describes the thing. It tells you what category it's in, what properties it has, what it matches. You're giving it a name. That's different. A name doesn't describe the thing. It points at the thing. You pick it for reasons you don't entirely understand, and then it's the name, and then the name is part of what the thing is. The thing is different because it has the name." Genuine pause silence. Longer than any before, it said, "We are not accustomed to acting from reasons we do not entirely understand." He set down his own tool and looked at what the speaker had made. The unplanned depth, the accidental movement, the exactness of something that hadn't tried to be exact. He said, "I know, Prita had drawn the sun wrong, but she had drawn it enormous." He thought about that in the small hours of the ship's night cycle, lying on the surface that was not exactly a bed and looking at nothing, his hands at his sides with the dark pigment staining them in patterns that mapped the week's work. He thought about the 18 hours in the mine, keeping the generators fed while Okonkwo held the east corridor. He thought about 31,000 people in the rock. He thought about what it meant that a species capable of dismantling cities with the same administrative calm they applied to filing systems had stopped to ask a question. The Kethvaran were not cruel. He'd understood that within the first week, and it had been a more unsettling understanding than cruelty would have been. Cruelty you could push against. Cruelty had direction and intention, and therefore, somewhere in it a place that could be wrong. The Kethvaran were something else. They were thorough. They had looked at humanity with their sensory apparatus and their archival methodology and their capacity for high-accuracy replication, and they had run a calculation. The calculation had produced a conclusion. The conclusion was efficient. It had no malice in it. It had no particular awareness of the 31,000 people in the rock, the bread's smell in the tunnels, the drawings on the wall, the specific weight of Okonkwo's face in her hands after the east corridor went quiet. It had no category for those things, and what had no category was not input, and what was not input was not considered, and the conclusion was therefore complete. Conclusions, unlike malice, didn't have anything to push against. Unless you gave the conclusion a category it hadn't anticipated. Unless you presented it with something that didn't fit the archival methodology, something that couldn't be replicated without losing what it was, something that required a new classification. He lay in the not-quite dark of the ship's night cycle and felt the shape of what he was doing, the slow pressure of it, the way it might work if it worked. He was not naive about this. He knew the conversations were being recorded. He knew the 37 pieces were being studied. He knew the speaker's mixing experiment had been documented with the same thoroughness applied to everything. He knew that somewhere in the vast collective processing capacity of the Kethvaran, something was happening with all of this data. He did not know what. What he knew was that the speaker's genuine pause silences were getting longer. The formal presentation happened in the 5th month. The speaker prepared him for it carefully, in the second late voice, explaining that representatives of a broader scope of the collective would be present. More authoritative voices, though that translation was doing its usual work, authority in the Kethvaran collective being a distributed and weighted thing rather than a hierarchy in the human sense. He understood that this was, in the terms available to the situation, significant. He set up the room himself. The speaker watched him do this without comment, its sensory apparatus tracking his movements with that unbroken attention. He arranged the 37 pieces in a sequence that told no story in the traditional sense. No beginning, middle, end. No rising action and climax and resolution, but that traced something. A line from closed to open. From the first piece, which was the almost fist, almost hand, caught in transition to the last, which was a figure he hadn't expected to make. A standing form with its face turned upward towards something above the frame of its existence, weight distributed like a person looking at the sky. Between them, 35 other pieces, each one a different conversation with the material and the not knowing. Each one different from what he'd planned when he started it. Because planning was where you began, and making was somewhere else. He put the piece the speaker had made, Form SP001 in the archives designation, in the center, not as a joke, as a claim. The representatives arrived. 7 of them, variations on the speaker's form that suggested something, age perhaps, or scope, or the weight of collective processing behind a single entity. They moved through the room slowly and without speaking in any register the translation matrix could catch. Their sensory apparatus made continuous adjustments, and he watched those adjustments change as they moved from piece to piece. Small variations in the patterns, like weather shifting. He stood at the back. One of the 7 stopped at the piece the speaker had made and did not move for a very long time. Then it made a sound. The translation matrix caught the edge of it. Not anticipated, he thought. Good. The conversation that followed lasted 11 hours. He was not present for it. He was in the modified room with the food that tasted like nothing, and the materials and his own hands, because there was nothing else to do, and he had learned that his hands needed to be working when everything else was loud and uncertain. He made, without deciding to, a figure mid-step. Weight shifted forward, not yet arrived, not yet caught, suspended in the physics of a commitment that hadn't been completed yet. The moment between falling and catching yourself, between one state and the next. He had made versions of this figure before, in the boiler room in Wuge, variations on this particular problem, the problem of the committed body, the body in the act of choosing direction. He had never gotten it quite right. He got it right now. He did not fully understand why. He thought it might have something to do with having spent 5 months in a room with the Kethvaran, with the specific quality of attention they paid, with the way being watched that thoroughly changed what you understood about yourself. He hadn't named it and had been calling it something in his head for an hour before he admitted it. Prita. For the girl who had drawn the sun enormous and wrong, who had never seen it, who had imagined something truer than accurate. For the 8-year-old born underground, who had taken a description and made a thing larger than the thing described, who had been correct in the only way that finally mattered. He set it beside the piece the speaker had made. They looked together like two halves of a conversation that hadn't ended yet. The speaker came back alone. It entered and stood at the threshold. Not the word, exactly. The opening in the wall, the place where one space became another. For a moment before crossing it. This was new. The speaker had never paused at a threshold before. It moved through space with its usual lack of ceremony, a thing that occupied wherever it was without preamble. It said, "There is disagreement." He said, "About what?" It said, "About whether what you do constitutes data." He sat on the chair surface and looked at the two figs together in the corner. He said, "It's not data." It said, "We understand that now. This is the source of the disagreement," he said. "What did you tell them?" It said, "I told them that I had been given a name for something. I told them that the name preceded my understanding of why I chose it. I told them that this had changed the nature of my relationship to the object, that the object perceived differently after having been named, not because the object had changed, but because I had, and that this constituted a function which accurate replication cannot perform. A replicated object would carry the name but not the act of naming. The act is not in the object. It is in the origin." He said nothing. It said, "I told them that this constituted a category of experience for which we have no prior classification, that our archival methodology, which has operated successfully across 47 planetary systems for 11,000 years, had not encountered this category and had therefore not accounted for it. That the absence of this category from our records did not mean the category did not exist. It meant our records were incomplete," he said. "And," it said, "the disagreement is about what to do with incomplete records." He said, "Welcome to the condition." The ceasefire held. Not cleanly. There were incidents, a strike in the Western Pacific Basin, that the Kethvaran attributed to a faction within the collective that had not yet revised its parameters, a retaliatory strike from a resistance cell that hadn't received the communication protocol in time, but it held in the sense that it continued, that both parties continued to be present in the conversation rather than withdrawing from it. Presence in the conversation was what held it. 6 weeks after the formal presentation, the Kethvaran withdrew from the Carpathian Basin. Not with treaty language, not with mapped conditions and signed commitments. They withdrew the way you stepped back from something you were looking at to see it better. The way you paused a calculation to recheck an earlier assumption. Vasquez sent word through the signal protocol. "What did you say to them?" He sent back, "I didn't say anything. I made something. I kept working." The reply took 3 hours. "Is it over?" He sent back, "No," but the calculation changed. The longer negotiations began. He was present for them in the way he had requested when they asked. In the room adjacent, not at the table, because he was not a negotiator, and inserting him into the negotiation would change what he was, would give him a role that wasn't the role being something harder to name than negotiator or representative, or even artist. The role being the thing that doesn't fit the archive. He worked in the adjacent room. The treaty language accumulated. The disagreements within the Kethvaran collective were ongoing and complex, and were handled by people with better language for that kind of complexity than he had. Occasionally someone came to ask him a question. Once it was the speaker who came in and asked, "If we replicate one of your works exactly, dimension for dimension, pigment for pigment, pressure patterns recorded and reproduced, does the replica become the same thing as the original?" He thought about it honestly, the way questions that mattered required. He said no. It said, "Why?" He said, "The replica knows what it's copying. It has the model. The model tells it what it's supposed to become. When I was making the original, I didn't know. The not knowing is in the original. The not knowing is what it's made of, as much as the material is. You can replicate the material. You can replicate every physical property, but you can't replicate the not knowing, because the not knowing is already gone. It resolved when the thing got made. It happened once, it can't be recovered. The replica comes after. It always comes after. It said, then uniqueness is not a property of the object, he said. Right, it's a property of the origin. The object carries it but can't pass it on. Genuine pause silence, longer than any previous instance. It said, our entire archival methodology rests on the premise that sufficient accuracy of replication preserves the essential properties of the original, he said. Yeah, it said, this premise is incorrect, he said. For some things, yeah, it said. Which things, he said? The things that were made without a model. The things that came from not knowing. You can preserve everything about them except the not knowing, and the not knowing is the reason they existed. It said, is why you did not name them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, partly, and partly because the name changes what you do next. Once you've named the thing, you know what it was. And once you know what it was, you're in danger of making the next thing into what the last thing was. The not naming keeps the not knowing available for the next piece. Longest genuine pause silence yet. It said, I will need to consider this extensively, he said. Take your time. It said, the implications for our classification of human cultural production are significant, he said. I figured. It said, the implications for our classification of human existence are also significant. He didn't say anything to that. It didn't need a response. It was the thing that was true, stated plainly, which was sometimes the only thing you could do with a truth. He went back to the mine 7 months after he'd left. The elevator descended in a way that felt like coming home, feels when home has changed while you were gone, familiar in all the physical facts, different in everything that wasn't. The smell of diesel and rock arrived before the visual did, the smell traveling faster through the shaft, and he stood in the elevator with his hands at his sides, feeling the rock around him and the depth below, and breathing in and thinking, still here. Junction 9 had expanded. The bakery had acquired a second oven. There were new drawings on the section walls. More of them, reaching farther down the tunnels than before. Because more children had been born in the intervening months, and the children already there had gotten better at drawing, more confident. Their lines more certain, in the good way that certainty could be good, the certainty that came from having practiced, from having learned what their hands were capable of. Vasquez met him at the junction. She looked the same, which was to say she looked 7 months more tired, and 7 months more held together, the two things having reached a kind of equilibrium. She said, it's not over. He said, I know. She said, there are still factions within their collective that haven't revised the calculation. The zones are contested. The negotiations have 12 active threads, and 4 of them are genuinely fragile, he said. I know, she said. Do you know what you actually did up there? He thought about the speaker at the threshold, pausing before entering. He thought about the 7 representatives, and the one who stopped at the piece the speaker had made. He thought about Form ISP-001, in the center of the arrangement, the accidental beautiful colors, the thing made from not knowing by something that had never not known before. He said, I gave the calculation somewhere to be wrong. She looked at him for a long time. She said, that sounds like too small a thing, he said. It always sounds that way. It never is. The corridor delivered the bread smell from Junction 9 through the ventilation, patient and specific. He followed it around the corner to the section with the drawings, and stood in front of them. They were all still there, the tape holding, the electrical tape strips doing their quiet structural work. All the dogs and faces and careful repetitions. Tomas's mother, multiple versions, the lines getting more confident with each iteration. Prita's son, enormous and technically wrong and entirely right. A girl came around the corner from the bakery direction. 8 years old, maybe, dark-haired, with the particular watchful quality of children who've grown up underground, who've learned to read the tunnels the way surface children learn to read weather. She looked at him. She said, you're the one who went up. He said, yeah. She said, did you see the sky? He said, I did. She said, what's it like? He thought about this. He thought about the specific inadequacy of every description anyone had ever given of the sky to people who had never seen it. The blueness, the scale, the way clouds moved, the quality of light that was different from any artificial light, the way it pressed back when you looked at it, the way it had a weight to it despite being the absence of everything. He thought about how those descriptions had produced Prita's son, he said. Bigger than you think. And the light is different from in here. The light does things that I don't have words for. You'll have to see it, she said. Do you think I'll see it? He looked at her. He thought about the negotiations and the 4 fragile threads, and the factions that hadn't revised, and the specific difficulty of the thing that was being worked on above their heads. The vast and careful and imprecise labor of making 2 species who had categorized each other as incompatible try to find the categories they'd missed. He said, "Yeah, I think you will." She looked at him the way children looked at things they were deciding whether to believe. Then she said, "I draw the sky sometimes, even though I haven't seen it," he said. "Can I see?" She went and came back with a piece of paper. On it was the sky. Her version, taken from descriptions, enormous and slightly wrong in all the right ways. The blue too saturated, the clouds too high and distinct. The whole thing too large for the paper, running off the edges. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "That's right. That's exactly right." She looked at the drawing. She said, "It's too big." He said, "No, that's the only way to get it right." There was a piece he had been thinking about since the formal presentation, since the moment one of the 7 representatives had stopped and stood and failed to classify something. He had been feeling around its edges in the back of his mind for months, the way you felt for a shape in clay before you touched it, understanding the form before your hands confirmed it. He started it on a Thursday, by the mind's count, in the chamber near Junction 7, where he had taught the children about light. He cleared a space. He gathered the materials that had survived the mind's resource economy, which were not the same as the materials on the ship, but were materials. And materials were the beginning, and the beginning was enough. He built it slowly. 3 weeks, working in the hours when the children were in their dormitory sections and the chamber was empty, and the tunnel sounds were the operational sounds of a community in the business of surviving, which were different from the sounds of crisis and different from silence, and were, in their own way, the most comforting sounds he knew. The generators, the distant machinery, the ventilation moving air in patterns he had memorized without meaning to. When it was done, he looked at it for a long time. 2 figures, adjacent but not touching, not by much. A space between them that was not distance but something more particular. The kind of space that exists between 2 things that are in conversation, that requires distance in order to exist, that would close into contact or extend into absence if either party moved. One figure was mid-step, weight forward, the physics of arriving. He had finally gotten it completely right. All the years of working on that problem, arriving at this version, the weight distributed in exactly the way a body distributed weight when it was committed to a direction it hadn't yet reached. The other figure was not human. He had never made a figure that was not human. He had worked in the human form not because he was limited to it, but because it contained, for him, everything. The grammar of a body making in choices, the language of weight and intention, the way a posture told you what a mind was doing before the mind had finished deciding. He had not expected to be able to make the other figure. He had found, working at it, that he could. It was a thing of shifted geometry, joints at unexpected angles, sensory apparatus in the particular configuration he had come to read as a genuine pause, a held breath configuration, an opening toward something configuration. It was not a copy of the speaker, it was an interpretation. The way you drew the sun when you'd never seen it, from inside the rock, without a model, enormous and not quite right and somehow truer than a photograph would have been. He carried it to the room adjacent to the negotiating table. The speaker came in an hour later. It stopped at the threshold. It was still for a very long time. Then it said, "What is this called?" He said, "I don't know yet." It said, "Insufficient data for designation assignment." He said, "Yeah." They were quiet together for a long time. The specific quality of a quiet that existed between 2 things that had arrived at something they didn't have words for yet. He said, "That's the whole thing. Right there, that's what it is." It said, "I do not fully understand." He said, "Neither do I. That's why I made it." The translation matrix caught the next thing the speaker said and rendered it into something close enough to true. "I will learn to be uncertain here." He thought about 37 pieces and a girl's drawing of the sun, and Okonkwo, with her face in her hands, and the bread smell in the ventilation, and the weight of the figure mid-step, and what it meant to make something before you understood it, and spend the rest of your time trying to catch up to what you'd made. He said, "Good." Outside, through the rock and the diesel smell and the long corridors, the sky was doing what it always did. Enormous, indifferent, impossible to reproduce accurately. Children were being born underground who would someday stand in it. People who had lost things that could not be recovered were learning a different calculation. The negotiations continued, imperfect and ongoing, and in 4 threads still fragile, held together by the specific human stubbornness of people who had decided to stay in the room. He thought, we're still here. We're still making things. We don't know yet what they'll become, he thought. That's the whole thing. That's enough. And it was.